Set in 1939, this film follows Don Fendler, a lively 12-year-old boy whose adventurous spirit often led him into trouble. The story begins on a summer afternoon, with Don splashing through the river, completely absorbed in his play. The quiet, peaceful moment was suddenly interrupted when his twin brother, Ryan, appeared at the riverbank, calling out for him to come home. His tone carried urgency, making it clear something important had happened. Their father, Donald, had finally returned after months away at work, and it was time for him to make good on his promise, a long-awaited fishing trip. Although the twins were born together, their personalities couldn't have been more different. Ryan was the obedient one, always cautious, always aware of his surroundings, while Don was the wild one, constantly restless, always pushing boundaries. Their father, though deeply loving toward both sons, was notably stricter with Don, seeing the fire in him and fearing that if left unchecked, it would lead him toward trouble. Over the years, Don came to resent this stricter treatment, convinced that no matter what he did, his father would always see him as reckless. The day before the trip, the twins eagerly prepared their fishing gear, their excitement bubbling over into playful talk about who would catch the most fish. But rather than working together, their excitement soon turned into bickering, their voices rising in frustration. Instead of laughing it off, they pushed each other further, their argument escalating until they started throwing punches. Their father, already on edge, stepped in immediately, ordering them to clean the car as punishment. Yet, rather than cooling down, the tension remained, turning a simple chore into another battleground. That evening, as the family gathered at the dinner table, the atmosphere remained tense. Donald, still frustrated, turned his attention back to Don, scolding him for the fight earlier. His words, sharp and direct, carried more than just frustration. They carried comparison. He pointed out Ryan's obedience, his patience, his ability to listen, drawing yet another line between them. Don sat in silence, trying to bite back his emotions, knowing that no matter what, he would never be the twin his father wanted. Then came the moment that shattered Don's excitement. The fishing trip was canceled. Donald had been called back to work in 2 days, leaving no time for the trip. Instead, he proposed an alternative adventure, a 2-day climb up Mount Katahdin with their cousin Henry. Donald reassured them that the climb was easy, designed for beginners, but Don wasn't interested. Fishing had meant everything to him, and climbing a mountain felt like a poor substitute. Frustrated and disappointed, he left the table without another word. Later that night, Don sat alone in his room, unable to shake the bitterness he felt. His mother, Ruth, noticed his disappointment and quietly sat beside him, hoping to ease his frustration. She spoke gently, explaining that their father wasn't as harsh as Don believed. She told him about the day he and Ryan were born, describing the rare moment of vulnerability she had witnessed. The way Donald had broken down in tears, overwhelmed by joy, convinced he had become the luckiest man alive. Don listened in silence, and for the first time, his resentment softened. His father had always seemed cold, distant, but perhaps there was a weight behind his actions, a responsibility Don had never fully understood. The bitterness didn't fade completely, but it began to loosen its grip. The next morning, they set off for the mountain, meeting Henry at the entrance of the campsite. Rather than starting their climb immediately, they decided to camp for the night, using the time to prepare for the trek ahead. As they settled into camp, Henry shared his knowledge of Mount Katahdin, pointing out its deceptive nature. From a distance, the peak looked gentle, almost inviting, but those who had climbed it before knew the truth. It was unpredictable, dangerous, and capable of changing within moments. Henry warned them about the shifting weather, explaining that storms could arrive without warning, turning a simple climb into a battle against the elements. As night fell and the fire crackled in the cold air, Henry turned the conversation toward legend. He spoke of Pomola, a mythical creature that was said to guard the mountain, keeping trespassers from reaching its peak. Its terrifying form was unforgettable: a moose's head, a man's body, the wings of an eagle, and talons sharp enough to tear through flesh. Local villagers believed Pomola controlled the mountain's fury, summoning storms as warnings for those who dared to ascend too high. The next morning, the sky was clear, the conditions perfect for the climb. As they began their ascent, Henry shared critical survival tips, explaining the importance of staying on the marked path. The white markings on the trees served as guides, ensuring that climbers never lost their way. He also warned them that if they ever got lost, screaming for help would be useless. The landscape would swallow their voices, rendering cries for assistance completely ineffective. Hours into the journey, they came across another group of climbers, their expressions tense, their movements hurried. Something wasn't right. Their voices carried urgency, and their warnings cut through the air like a cold wind. A storm had settled over the peak, making further ascent dangerous. The climbers strongly advised against continuing, urging them to turn back before the weather worsened. As the rocky path got steeper and rougher, Donald called for a halt, sensing the weather turning nasty and making the climb way riskier. But Don wasn't having it. He dug his heels in, refusing to back down. He was dead set on proving they weren't just kids following orders, but capable of holding their own. With the wind whipping around them and the looming storm creeping in, he squared his shoulders and insisted they press on, determined to show his father that they had the grit to handle real challenges. 2 hours still remained before they would reach the summit, and Donald knew the situation demanded caution. The worsening conditions convinced him that turning back was the safest option for himself and his youngest son, who had begun to show signs of fatigue. He entrusted Henry with the responsibility of guiding the remaining climbers to the peak, instructing them to be mindful of the conditions while he returned to the campsite. As they continued their ascent, the air grew heavier with the weight of an approaching storm. The winds had strengthened considerably, slicing through their clothes and bringing with them a relentless downpour. The cold began to take a toll, seeping into their skin until the shivering became uncontrollable. Ryan was hit the hardest. His movements faltered, and his body shook violently with each step forward. Don, noticing his brother's worsening condition, removed his sweater and draped it over Ryan's shoulders, ensuring he had some protection from the harsh elements. Navigating the treacherous landscape required patience. But despite the mounting obstacles, their determination remained unwavering. By the time they reached the summit, the feeling of triumph was unmistakable, though it carried with it an air of disappointment. Under normal conditions, they should have been able to see the vast stretch of land below, the forests, rivers, and even the campsite where their father was waiting for them. Instead, visibility was non-existent, the dense fog rendering the view completely inaccessible. Recognizing the need for urgency, Ryan expressed his concern about staying at the peak for too long. His thoughts centered around the growing anxiety their father must have been feeling, waiting for their return while the storm intensified. He insisted that the safest course of action was to begin their descent immediately, but Don was reluctant to agree. The frustration he had carried for so long resurfaced, the years of unfulfilled promises and forced patience unraveling in his mind. In his view, it had always been them waiting for their father, the ones enduring disappointment time and time again. There was nothing wrong with allowing their father to experience that same feeling, even for a little while. The remark created a sudden tension between them, an unspoken resentment revealing itself in the quiet space between their exchange. What had once been a celebration of their accomplishment turned into a reminder of the distance they still had between them. The atmosphere shifted, and before Henry could attempt to de-escalate the moment, Don had already decided on his next move. Without warning, he turned away from them and sprinted down the mountain alone, his emotions fueling his recklessness. The severity of the storm had left the terrain dangerously slick, and Don quickly realized how unstable his footing had become. The uneven ground threatened his balance, forcing him to focus on every step he took. But the warning came too late. His foot landed at an awkward angle against a wet rock, sending his weight forward as his momentum took over. In a split second, his body lurched downward, slipping past the designated climbing path and tumbling into the depths below. Panic overtook him instantly. He attempted to call out for Ryan and Henry, but the violent roar of the storm swallowed his voice whole. Each attempt to scream for help yielded the same result. His words lost to the force of the relentless rain. His vision, already compromised by the thickening fog, deteriorated further as darkness settled around him. He tried to reorient himself, to find something solid to grasp, but each move only led to another stumble. Ryan and Henry, now breathless, arrived back at the campsite where Donald had been waiting. The sight of them immediately set off alarm bells in his mind. Rising to his feet, he searched their faces for an explanation, though his instinct already confirmed his worst fears. The urgency in Harry's voice provided the answer. Don had broken away from them, ignoring their pleas to return. They had chased after him but soon lost sight of him in the storm, unable to determine where he had fallen. At that moment, Don had landed roughly against the forest ground, his body scraping against the jagged terrain as he fought to regain control of his movements. His breathing was uneven, and his pulse hammered against his chest, but the exhaustion settling into his limbs left him momentarily unable to move. As he attempted to push himself upward, he fell into the shallow mud, and an animal skull lay partially buried. The sight was enough to send a renewed wave of panic through him, and his immediate instinct was to retreat. However, his struggle to escape the eerie discovery led him into another obstacle. The thorn bushes caught hold of his limbs, ensnaring him in their sharp embrace. The more he fought against them, the deeper they cut into his skin. Frustration clouded his judgment, and without thinking, he shed his outer clothes, freeing himself from the grip of the branches and continuing his frantic escape into the unknown. Donald and Henry had already set out, determined to retrace the path that would hopefully lead them to Don. The worsening conditions complicated their search, but they refused to consider the possibility of failure. With each passing moment, Donald's concern evolved into desperation, forcing him to accept that immediate action was necessary. He ordered Henry to contact the forest rangers, knowing that if Don wasn't located soon, survival would become increasingly unlikely. Don had long since lost track of time, the darkness swallowing everything around him until orientation was impossible. His shoes, having endured the brutal journey, began to tear apart, leaving his feet vulnerable to the unforgiving landscape. His injuries multiplied, but his exhaustion left him numb to the pain. Wrapping his bleeding foot in his damp socks, he pressed forward, determined to continue despite the suffering his body endured. His thoughts drifted to home, to his mother's warmth and reassurance. The grief rising in his chest consumed him as regret overtook his senses. He cursed his recklessness, the foolishness of his anger, the senseless decision that had led him to this moment. If given the chance to return, he swore he would be the best son imaginable, promising himself that he would change. By the time the search teams arrived at the mountain, the effort to locate Don had expanded significantly. The flashlights illuminated the path as voices called out his name, but as the hours passed, their certainty in finding him grew weaker. Donald, struggling to accept the reality unfolding before him, finally made the most difficult decision of his life. He contacted Ruth, his voice heavy as he delivered the devastating news. Don was missing. The next morning, as Don woke from his shallow sleep, a feather rested near him, carried by the storm's wind. His fingers wrapped around it, his mind recalling the legend Henry had spoken of earlier. He tucked the feather into his shirt pocket, allowing the weight of his predicament to settle further. The forest was relentless, and as time continued forward, mosquitoes and insects gathered around him, adding another layer of discomfort to his condition. His movements were slow, directionless, and the landscape around him only became more unforgiving. His path was uncertain, his survival dependent on luck. At the same time, Ruth had arrived at the search site, desperate for answers. The ranger she spoke to conveyed doubts about Don's survival, citing the strength of the wind during the time of his disappearance. It became clear that the search effort was no longer centered on finding him alive, but rather on recovering his body. The revelation shattered Donald, confirming the grim thoughts that had been circling his mind. The forest was vast, the sheer size of it presenting challenges that seemed insurmountable. The rangers emphasized the difficulty in locating someone lost in such an expanse, estimating the terrain to stretch over 100 hectares. Memories surfaced, and Donald found himself recalling the message he had instilled in his children. If lost in the forest, they must hold on to their common sense, follow the flow of water, and continue moving forward. The advice had seemed simple at the time, but imagining Don in his current situation, he understood just how impossible those instructions would be to follow. 3 days had passed, and Don remained wandering. His instincts led him toward a small river, the sight granting him a fleeting moment of peace. He allowed himself to embrace it, indulging in the water as a temporary escape from his reality. But the comfort was short-lived. As he rested, a strange sensation overtook him, his skin crawling with a presence unseen. He hurried to investigate, his hands frantically pulling at his clothes. What he found was that leeches covered his body, clinging to him as he struggled to remove them. His breath became labored, and with sheer determination, he rid himself of the creatures. Nearby, the lifeless form of a small bird lay in the dirt, a victim of an eagle's hunt. The sight unnerved him, the image presenting itself as an omen. On the fourth day, frustration settled over the search efforts, as Donald and the others struggled to find clarity regarding Don's whereabouts. The sheer vastness of the wilderness made the search feel impossible, and the lack of leads began chipping away at their hope. Realizing the need for a wider approach, Donald suggested bringing in a helicopter to cover more ground and increasing the number of volunteers to comb through the forest. Meanwhile, in another part of town, Ruth took matters into her own hands, reaching out to newspapers in the hope that widespread coverage would bring in more hands to aid the search. The urgency in her voice carried through each conversation. She contacted the fire department, the governor, and anyone with the means to help bring her son home. The efforts paid off. By the next morning, word of Don's disappearance had spread significantly, and a large number of volunteers gathered at the search site, prepared to sweep through the forest in hopes of finding something, anything that could lead to Don. Don, on the other hand, had drifted deeper into the wilderness, pushing forward without a sense of direction. Exhaustion clawed at him, but he refused to stop. As he trudged through the dense terrain, his eyes landed on an abandoned mine, its structure worn down and forgotten by time. Inside, he found remnants of old life, objects that hinted at past inhabitants. Cutlery, rusted metal, fragments of wood long since left behind. The sight sparked a deep hunger in him, and his thoughts immediately turned toward finding food. A river nearby seemed promising, and so he attempted to catch fish, hoping to fill the emptiness gnawing at his stomach. But his efforts proved futile. Each attempt ended in failure. He pushed on, desperate to succeed, but after countless tries, his energy dwindled, his frustration mounting. His breath came labored, and the hunger tightened its grip until he could no longer ignore it. Defeated, he sat by the water, his mind growing foggy. Then, in a fleeting moment of clarity, an idea struck him. His shirt? He removed it, folding it into a makeshift net, and tried again. This time, his movements were calculated, his patience steady, and before long, he caught something, a large fish, thrashing against the fabric. The sight filled him with a momentary rush of relief, and without hesitation, he took it back to the mine, eating it raw, no longer caring about anything other than silencing his hunger. As he sat within the hollow of the abandoned structure, his thoughts drifted home. The warmth of his family, the comfort of sitting at the dinner table, the quiet conversations that once seemed trivial, everything felt distant now, and the weight of his isolation pressed against him. He had taken so much for granted, assuming that certain things would always be there, but now, lost in the vastness of the unknown, he was more determined than ever to get back. With newfound resolve, Don pressed forward, trying to recall every lesson his father had taught him. He followed the flow of water, moving as instructed, but soon the night descended, forcing him to stop. He knew that continuing in the darkness was a death sentence, and so he settled once again within the forest, preparing for yet another night exposed to the harsh elements. 6 days had now passed since Don had gone missing, and the case had become a widely discussed headline. More than 150 volunteers had gathered in the search effort, making it one of the most significant rescue missions in the area's history. But despite the massive deployment, the majority had lost hope in finding Don alive. Their efforts had shifted. Rather than rescuing a lost boy, they were searching for remains. Many of them were waiting for the first signs of decay, expecting that soon the scent of death would lead them to their answer. By the 7th day, the rescue teams encountered something they had feared, a foul odor rising from a gap in the rocks. The volunteers moved quickly, convinced that they had finally found Don's body, but as they attempted to investigate, no adult could fit through the narrow opening. Ryan, present at the search site, volunteered to check. The decision sparked hesitation, as Donald knew the risks, but given the circumstances, he had no choice but to allow it. Ryan was carefully lowered into the gap, the tension thick as everyone waited in anticipation. But soon after, relief spread through the group. The smell had not come from Don's body, but rather from the carcass of a coyote that had perished within the crevice. A week had passed, and the collective conclusion was unavoidable. The volunteers, one by one, decided that it was time to end the search. Their resources had been exhausted, and the chances of finding Don alive had long since faded. However, Donald remained unconvinced. Something felt unfinished, and he refused to let go without marking additional locations that had yet to be explored. Don, meanwhile, had reached a point of near surrender. His strength had deteriorated, his body fragile, his mind consumed by delirium. The night had settled once more, and as he curled beneath the cold sky, his eyes landed on an impossible sight. Standing before him, shrouded in shadows, was Pamola. The creature, its moose-like head, its human body, its powerful wings, moved forward, and in that moment, Don felt no fear. Instead, as Pamola wrapped its wings around him, he felt warmth, he felt understanding, he felt something beyond explanation. Within the creature's embrace, memories surfaced. His childhood, the times his father read stories to him at night, the nights he pretended to sleep just so he could be carried to bed. He recalled the moments when, as the years passed, his father had begun to view him not as a child but as someone older, someone capable of independence, and the closeness they once had began to fade. In that absence, he had acted out, fighting for attention, rebelling in ways he didn't fully understand. And now, lost in the vastness of the unknown, he realized how much he had wanted to be seen. Back at camp, Donald awoke suddenly, a feeling of restlessness pulling him out of sleep. An overwhelming urgency took hold, and before he could think, he was running into the forest, ignoring the danger, ignoring the darkness. His body moved on instinct, desperation guiding his every step. But then, in an unexpected twist, fate delivered a cruel punishment. Blinded by panic, Donald collided with a sharp branch, the impact slicing into his left eye. He stumbled back, pain ripping through his senses, and when he finally collapsed, the damage had already been done. The diagnosis later confirmed what he already knew. His left eye would never see again. The news reached Ruth quickly, and she rushed to check on his condition. In that moment, all masks were removed. She admitted the truth she had long kept hidden. Since Don's disappearance, she had believed, without doubt, that if one of them had to be lost, it should be Don. Not out of cruelty, but because she believed in him. She knew he was strong enough to find his way home. And Donald, weakened but reflective, finally admitted something he had never voiced before. He had failed as a father. He should have embraced his sons when they greeted him, should have allowed them to feel his presence, his warmth. Instead, seeing Don mirror his own stubbornness, he had treated him harshly, believing discipline was the way. And in doing so, he had forgotten what Don truly needed. A father figure, not just a teacher. 9 days into Don's disappearance, his condition worsened. His body barely functioned, his strength waning. But despite everything, he refused to stop walking. His hunger, his fatigue, his injuries, they consumed him, yet he still moved forward. As his vision blurred, hallucinations took hold. Within the dense forest, he saw his bed, appearing inexplicably in the wilderness. The urge to rest overwhelmed him, and as he lay down, his family surrounded him. Their presence felt real, their smiles, their warmth, their embrace. He began to accept it, believing this was his end, until suddenly, his father appeared in his vision. The sight of him was clear, unwavering, and in that moment, his father's eyes, despite the darkness, called him home. The moment Don's eyes fluttered open, the weight of exhaustion pressed down on him, his body aching, battered, barely holding on. The world around him was silent except for the rustling leaves, the towering trees casting long shadows over the damp earth beneath him. With what little strength he had left, he fought to rise, limbs shaking from days of wandering, starving, pushing forward through relentless terrain. His breath came in ragged gasps, each step a battle. But somehow, he broke free from the suffocating grip of the forest. The river stretched before him, its presence a lifeline, shimmering under the afternoon light, and then he saw a woman at the river's edge. Summoning every last shred of energy, he screamed for help, his voice cracking from exhaustion. But it was enough. The news of Don's survival spread like wildfire, a moment of hope after 9 days of uncertainty. The rescue team rushed to the riverbank, lifting the boy from the jaws of the wilderness, bringing him back to the world he had fought so desperately to return to. His mother arrived next, her relief spilling into tears, her embrace tight enough to hold all the fear she had buried for days. It was revealed that Don had walked more than 80 miles, an impossible feat, even for grown men. His survival was a miracle, a story that defied logic and expectation. Taken to the hospital, he was greeted by crowds, welcomed with the warmth of everyone. And then, his father. Donald stood before him, his expression a storm of emotions, but when Don apologized, expecting anger, he was met with something else entirely. Donald pulled him into an embrace, a hug heavy with unspoken words, a quiet acknowledgement of his son's strength, his resilience, and the fact that he had made it back home at all.